I'm going to start with the presumption that everybody already understands that behavior is important and talk about how we deal with that. I want to start by acknowledging some of my collaborators. Brett Harvey is the fish ecologist, without whom I wouldn't be able to say anything intelligent about fish. And Steve Jackson is the programmer that made all the code run. And everything intelligent I learned about modeling, I learned from Volker Grimm and his colleagues at the UFZ Institute in Leipzig. And I'm affiliated with a unique little environmental modeling program in the math department, and it's highly interdisciplinary at Humboldt State. And funding for this work has come from a variety of both conservation agencies and the electric power industry, because a lot of it has to do with hydropower management. So in overview, I want to talk about how do we address conservation problems when behavior is important, and I want to emphasize that I'm not going to talk about how could we in the future, but how people are actually doing it right now. And the two techniques I'm going to talk about are using individual-based models and a modeling strategy called pattern-oriented modeling. And I'm going to use some examples, not all about fish, because I'm tired of talking about the same old fish models all the time. But examples about developing models and the theory in them for how individuals behave, and then an example of how behavior affects our understanding of conservation problems. And finally, I'm going to speculate on why I think conservation biologists like us are someday going to rule the world of theoretical ecology. So theoretical ecologists admit that behavior is important. Here's a famous paper from 1993 in which Peter Abrams points out that if we give prey individuals credit for being smart enough to try to avoid predators, then even our most basic classic models of predator-prey relationships aren't valid. And this is a widely cited review from 2003 of all the empirical research that was done since then to show, in fact, that prey individuals are smart enough to try to get away from predators. And ecology in general has taken a straightforward approach to understanding the effects of behavior. They think about some behavior and what is the effect of that particular behavior on some ecological relationship. So how does predator avoidance behavior affect trophic relationships like the predator-prey interactions? And they made lots of progress. We've gone from simple classical models like the Latka-Volterra predator-prey models, equations, to models like this with really big equations. I think as a conservation biologist, we can look at these kind of models and say, well, that's really interesting, but how does that help me deal with management of this particular river with this particular fish? And where am I supposed to get all these parameters that I don't even really understand, and I'm not really sure that I can accept the basic assumptions that are behind this model. So conservation biologists tend to look at things the other way around. We're looking at a specific system, and we're interested in how the system responds to some particular change. And we think that some behaviors are important to affecting this response. And so we need to find useful models of those behaviors that help us solve the problem that we're trying to do. For example, how does a streamfish population change if you alter the flow and the temperature in the river, when we know that fish adapt to changes in their physical habitat by doing things like changing which location they choose to feed in? So those are the ways that we look at these behavior-related problems. So how do we do it? How can we model the conservation of populations and communities in a way that includes behavior? And the answer that I spend my time with is the use of individual-based models. So individual-based models are natural for representing behavior because you represent the individuals and you can program what the individuals do, what behaviors they have. But they are population models, so they're natural for representing the effects of behavior on populations and communities. They can be general and theory-based, and that's what I'm going to talk about. And they're becoming more and more feasible. It's not so hard to build these as it was 10 or 15 years ago because we have a variety of software tools and techniques and a wonderful book on how to do it that we didn't used to have. So what is an individual-based model? It's a computer simulation model. First of all, it's a population model. So we're not trying to represent everything we know about individuals. We're trying to represent a population, but we're representing it as a collection of individuals that live in a virtual environment. So what do we have to have in this model about the individuals? Well, if we try to put in there everything that we know about what individuals do, it'll be too complicated to be useful. So we include just enough about the individuals to solve a particular problem. So we start with a particular kind of problem that we're trying to solve or address with the model, and include just enough about the individuals. And for conservation problems, that usually means something about the individual state, their sex, their size, how much energy they have, where they are. We almost always need something about their physiology, their metabolic performance, maybe swimming speed, their growth, and then something about their behavior. How do they adapt when their world changes? The first example I want to show is from one of the first really successful individual-based conservation models, and it's from right here in Dorset. It's a shorebird model that Richard Stillman of Bournemouth University and his colleague John Gus Custard are primarily responsible for. This model addresses the question for shorebirds that feed on the kind of tidal mudflats that we saw last night on the boat cruise. How does the availability of food and feeding habitat affect their survival? So given that these, as the tide cycle changes and different kinds of food become available in different places, how do they adapt by deciding where to feed and what kind of food to prey on and when to feed in different places? So this is just a little animation from their model that shows through the tidal cycle how these birds move around and feed on different habitats. So that's the key behavior in this model. And this model has been really successful. They've applied it to problems like the impacts of coastal development, putting in piers, et cetera, designing mitigation for those kinds of developments, and regulating shellfishing and human disturbance. So they use this model routinely to solve real-world conservation problems. So getting back to this question, how do we model conservation of populations and communities in a way that includes behavior? So I'm proposing the use of individual-based models, but also the use of tested theory for the adaptive behaviors of the individuals. So when we say we have this model with individual behavior, immediately the question is, well, how do we model individual behavior? And how do we convince people that we have a useful model of individual behavior? And that's what I'm going to focus on now. First, I want to define what we mean by theory for adaptive behavior in an individual-based model. And this definition of theory is taken from the complex systems literature. It's basically models of what individuals do, how they make adaptive decisions, that we've shown are useful for explaining the system's dynamics. So again, we're not trying to build a perfect model of what individuals do, but we're trying to show that we have enough of the essence of individual behavior to make a realistic system model. The way we do this is what we call the pattern-oriented modeling theory development cycle. We start with empirical literature and our own field work, et cetera, information about the real world, and we do two things with that. First, we identify a set of characteristic patterns of emergent behavior. So these are often very basic, non-controversial, qualitative patterns that we observe in how the system responds to the kinds of things that are important for the conservation problem that we're trying to solve. And we try to find a relatively small number, but of diverse patterns. And I like to think of these patterns as these are responses that if your model could not reproduce these patterns, then you would not feel comfortable using it to solve the problem that you're building the model for. The other thing you do with the empirical literature is propose alternative theories. Come up with some ideas for how you think the individuals behave. And they might be based partly on existing behavioral ecology or just statistical models based on the data that you have from observations, or might be just some simple rules that you come up with. Then you put these alternative theories in an individual-based model and try to see if the model then reproduces these patterns that you identified from the real world. And then you can make this a cycle. You see how well the original theories work, and if they do the job, fine, one of them does. Otherwise, you can continue, do some more research, often design specific studies to further refine your model of individual behavior. So I want to show an example of this process. It's a new project that I've just been working on with Matt Johnson in our Department of Wildlife. It doesn't have to do with fish, but it has something to do with something that's dear to most fish biologists, at least in the US, which is coffee. This is a picture of a tropical coffee farm. This is the kind of habitat that Matt Johnson works in. You can see it's a combination of essentially coffee monoculture. These little shrubs in rows are coffee trees. There's patches where the coffee is underneath a higher canopy of shade trees, and this is when you hear people talk about shade-grown coffee, that's what this is. And there's patches of just forest and trees in the periphery. So the conservation problem is about birds and beetles and coffee. So this is believe it or not, this is a coffee berry, and this little nub on the end is a coffee borer beetle. And the female beetle spends all day drilling a hole into the coffee berry, and then once it gets through, it builds a nest and raises a couple of broods in there and destroys the coffee berry. And they're the bad guys. The good guys are Americans, of course. These are Americans. These are American songbirds that migrate to Jamaica in the winter and spend the winter there. And they feed in all the trees and forests on all sorts of bugs. But when there are lots of these coffee berries, Matt found that these birds will actually pick the females off the coffee berries and eat them, and actually provide a real ecosystem service in controlling the pest infestation of coffee. So we built a model and basically built patches of these different kinds of habitat. So the problem in the model is how do changes in land use, especially the amount of sun-grown coffee and shade-grown coffee, affect the survival of the birds, because there's more food in where there's more trees. So we need a certain amount of trees in order to maintain the population of birds so that they're there when the coffee berries, borers come out. And the key adaptive behavior is just the selection of foraging habitat by the birds. So how did these birds decide which patch of habitat to feed in? So we came up with 4 alternative models. The first is what we call a null model. It doesn't really have any intelligent behavior. We just say at each 1-minute time step, the bird randomly picks from among the 9 patches, including where it already is and its surrounding neighbor patches. The second model is what we call an optimal departure model. It's taken from some classical behavioral ecology theory from birds. Basically says you stay in one place until you've depleted the food down to a level that's below some threshold. And in this case, we said if you stay in one place until you've eaten the food down to the point where you realize you can't meet your daily food requirement, and then you just move someplace else randomly. The third alternative is to pick the best destination over a short distance. So we assume the birds have the ability to sense the food in the surrounding patches and just move to the patch with the highest food intake. And the fourth one is exactly the same, except we assume, kind of as an exaggeration, that the birds can detect the best patch within a very wide radius. So Matt and his grad students have identified a variety of patterns of bird behavior in the system. We identified 9 simple and qualitative patterns, and then tested whether each of the 4 alternative behavior models could reproduce those 9 patterns. So I'm going to give just a few examples. The third pattern is that bird densities are 2 to 3 times higher in the shade coffee than they are in the sun coffee. So here's our random model, our null model, and we can see that the bird density is a little bit higher in the shade coffee than it is in the sun coffee, but not really much different. Whereas with all 3 of the other models, we did get this ratio of 2 to 3 times higher bird densities in the shade coffee. So from that experiment, we can say that the random model isn't as good as the other ones. The fifth pattern that we looked at was that when there's a local eruption of insect food, just in a little patch somewhere, Matt's noticed there's suddenly an outbreak of bugs and the birds swarm in, and there's a high density of birds when that happens. And so when we used our optimal destination rule, where we let the birds move to the patch with the highest food, we get exactly the response that we want. That when there's this outbreak of food, the birds flock in at high densities and eat that food. Now what was really interesting is on the right side, the optimal departure model, where the birds stay in one place and deplete the food down and then move randomly, produced just the opposite response of what we wanted. So I don't know if you can figure out why. Basically, they don't have any way of detecting where there is good food, so they're moving randomly. But when they stumble into this patch of high food availability, they quickly meet their daily requirement and stop and go home. So there's actually fewer hours of bird feeding in that high quality habitat. So from that experiment, we could exclude this theory for behavior because it didn't reproduce this one key pattern. So the final scorecard for these 4 alternative behavior theories looks like this. Here's our different patterns. And you can see that most of the theories reproduced most of the patterns, but only one of them reproduced all the patterns. So that's the one that we actually kept to use in the model. All right. Now I'll finally get to fish. And this is, I'm going to talk about the model that was running before I started my talk. It's called InStream. It's an individual-based stream trout model. We basically built it to look at the effects of flow and temperature and channel shape on river trout populations. And for those of you that are familiar with the InStream flow conservation world, we basically built this as an alternative that overcomes some of the well-known limitations of PHAB-SIM, which is an old model that people have used for a long time. So this is the model. Basically, the little blue line segments are the individual trout. The habitat changes. They live in just little patches of river habitat. We're looking down from on top. The water flows from the right to the left. And each of these little cells has a depth and velocity that changes every day with the daily flow, and the temperature changes. And we model how much food they get and how the predation risk depends on things like the depth and the velocity and the size of the fish. And so the key behavior is habitat selection. How do they decide which of these cells they're going to occupy? They also compete for food, so the biggest fish gets to go first and pick the best cell, and the next biggest fish only gets whatever food is left after the big guy gets to go. So this behavior of habitat selection, I'm sure everybody here is familiar with it. It involves a trade-off between mortality risks and energy intake. So if you're a big fish and you're just trying to be safe from the predators, which are mostly birds in this system, we call them mergansers here. They're goosanders. So to be safest, you would hide in this dark spot over here. If you're trying to just maximize your food intake, you might be out where there's more sunlight, more velocity, so you can catch more food, but you might be more likely eaten. If you're a little fish, you probably want to be in shallow habitat to stay away from the big fish because that's your biggest predation risk. So these adaptive behaviors often require trade-offs like this. They depend on the individual state, like whether you're big or you're small or you're hungry or you're not hungry. They depend on the behavior of other individuals. So if there's a bigger fish that occupies the habitat that you want, you can't go there because he'll beat you up and chase you out. And these behaviors have to respond to unforeseeable changes because this particular study site can look just like this on the next day. So the fish, if we're going to model how they select habitat, they have to be able to adapt very rapidly when the environment changes. So how do we do this? I don't have time to go through the whole process we went through to develop the theory that we used there. It's been published a couple of times. But we call it state and prediction-based theory. It's based on some classical behavioral ecology methods. I'll explain it, how we implement it in this model. Basically, we use a time horizon of 90 days because that's about how long it takes a salmonid to starve to death. The fish make a simple prediction about the future habitat. They just assume that whatever today's conditions are going to persist over the 90 days. So whatever today's weather is going to stay for 90 days. So it's a prediction that's obviously wrong, but it turns out to be quite useful. So for each habitat cell that a fish could occupy, they look at it, they predict how much food they would or energy they would gain or lose if they stayed there over the time horizon, what their change in weight and condition would be, and therefore what the probability of starving over this 90-day time horizon is. And then they also look at the predation risk and figure out what their risk of being eaten over that time horizon is. And then they just move to the habitat with the highest probability of surviving over the time horizon. So that includes surviving both starvation and predation. So it depends on the predation risk, the food intake, and also the animal's current conditions. So if it's already underweight, it's going to make a different decision because starvation risk is a higher, larger factor in its decision. So does this method work? So we did exactly the same kind of simulation experiment where we put this decision theory in our model. And we compared it to some alternatives just to make it fun. The two alternatives were first probably the most common decision theory in behavioral ecology is just that animals try to maximize their immediate growth rate. We also compared it to if they're just trying to maximize their immediate survival rate. And we looked at patterns such as that when there's a high flow, the fish just kind of move to the side of the channel and wait for the high flow to recede, that there's hierarchical feeding. If you introduce a larger competitor, then the fish shift their habitat in response. Same thing if you introduce predators, they shift their habitat use in response. And the two that turned out to be really key were, first of all, that trout have been observed to occupy higher velocities when temperatures are higher, and that they respond very quickly in their habitat use when you drastically change the food supply. And only the theory that assumes that the fish are thinking about what happens in the future could reproduce those last two patterns. Okay, so that was really easy. That only took us a year or two to do. So then we thought, let's try something hard. So there's been quite a bit of literature recently about how real trout actually adaptively select their activity as well as their habitat. That they actively switch between feeding during the daytime and at night. It used to be biologists thought, well, the brown trout in this stream are night feeders and the rainbow trout in this stream are day feeders. But there's lots of evidence now that the individuals actually switch back and forth. And so we thought, let's try to add this second adaptive behavior to our model. So the way we represent the decision is that the individuals are trying to choose a good combination of feeding or hiding during the day and the night. So they have four alternatives. They can feed in the day and hide at night, or they can feed in the day and feed at night, or hide in the day and feed at night, or just hide all the time. And they decide that at the start of every day and every night. So some of the additional complexities that this adds, so now both the growth of the fish and the mortality risk vary not only with time as the flow and temperature change, with space among the different cells, and with individual characteristics like size. But now it depends also on whether it's day or night, because there's much lower feeding success at night because it's dark and hard to see the food. But there's also much lower predation risk at night because it's harder for the predators to see you. And the growth and mortality vary with activity, whether you're feeding or hiding. So if you're hiding, you're not getting any food, so you're slowly losing weight. But there's much lower predation risk because you're not out exposed to predators. So the way the model fish behave is at the start of every day and night period, they evaluate each combination of these four combinations of activity for each of the habitat cells that they might occupy. And they select the combination of cell and activity that maximizes their expected survival over the time horizon. So now we want to do a pattern-oriented analysis of this theory. And it turns out that many patterns of diel habitat selection have been observed in trout. And so we tested whether we could reproduce these. And actually, Neil Metcalf and his group up at Glasgow University published a whole series of papers on this empirical observations of how salmonids switch between day and night feeding activity through the 1990s. And Neil was courteous enough to send me this picture of one of his laboratory setups where they did some of these experiments. So one pattern was that there was more feeding at night when the temperature is low. And this is actually our model results. They look very similar to the graphs in one of these papers. At the lower temperatures, almost 100% of the feeding goes on at night. As the temperature increases up to about 10, then it's about half at night and half during the day. And the mechanism is very clear. It's just that when it's cold, the metabolism is lower, so the fish need less food to maintain themselves. So why take the risk of going out in the day if you can get the amount of food that you need at night? So they need less food, so they feed at night when they can't catch as much, but they can get enough and avoid the predators. A similar pattern is that there's more daytime feeding when food is scarce. So in our model, we just varied the amount of food. And when the food was very low, 100% of the fish fed during the day. As we increased the food until it was quite high, then almost none of the fish fed during the day because they could get their daily requirement at night when there's lots of food. The other patterns that we could reproduce, the feeding fish use shallower habitat at night. They feed closer together at night, and that's just a consequence of they can see and feed over a smaller distance when it's dark, so they can share habitat closer together. And competition from larger fish can actually increase daytime feeding, so there's competition over time as well as space. None of these things were programmed into the model. These just emerged from our behavior rule. So once we'd done that model and that experiment, actually for this conference, I did an example simulation experiment to look at this question of how does behavior affect our understanding of conservation problems. And in particular, I focused on this concept of food limitations. And I started thinking about this actually when I reviewed a paper where this young person had implied that they felt like it looked like there was enough food in the stream for the population that was there, so therefore the population shouldn't be food limited. And after working with this kind of behavior model, it kind of made me wonder would our model really support that basic conceptual model? So this is kind of a traditional conceptual model of food limitation, that when food is relatively low, it strongly affects the population, it limits it. So a change in food availability would result in a change in population. But once food availability is high, then there's enough food for the population, and so it doesn't limit it, and so more food would not necessarily produce a response in population. So we did a simulation experiment using an existing application of our model. This is a 1 kilometer reach of the Green River in Utah. It doesn't look like classic trout habitat to some of you, being out in the middle of the desert, but it's below a big reservoir that releases cold water, and it actually has quite a robust brown trout population. So to test this conceptual model of food availability, we just ran the model with different, we just kept increasing the amount of food in the model. Ran the model for 7 years so that the population could reproduce and respond to the change in food availability. And the result we got was a graph that looks like this. As food availability goes up, the population just keeps going up. So if you compare the conceptual model that shows a decreasing rate of population increase as food increases, we got an increasing rate of population growth as we kept increasing food. So the more food we added, the more fish we got, and even at a higher rate. So what caused that? Could it be due to behavior? Probably. And so which behavior? And we really didn't know the answer to that question. So we did an experiment where we did something you can do in a model that you can't do with real fish, which is just turn some behaviors off and see which one seems to be important. So the first thing we did was, well, what happens if we turn off habitat selection behavior? So instead of letting the trout pick the best cell, we just randomized their perception of the quality of the different cells. So they basically chose randomly from among the fair to good cells. If we randomized all the cells, then too often they ended up in a really bad place and the population always went extinct. But there's still, once they've chosen a cell, they choose the best activity there, whether they should feed or hide on that particular time period. And that produced very similar results. When the food was still relatively low, the population size was quite a bit lower, but eventually caught up at really high food levels. So that doesn't explain why we got this response. So what happens if we turn off the hierarchical feeding behavior? Basically, this behavior of the biggest fish gets to go first. So instead, we randomize the order in which the fish get to choose the cell that they occupy every time. And again, we got pretty much the same shape response. And in fact, when we turn off hierarchical feeding, we get lots and lots more fish. So when you don't have the big individuals dominating and there's lots of food, then the population was actually far higher. In fact, it got to the point we couldn't finish the simulations because the computer just couldn't do it. So then what happens if we turn off this activity selection? So we make the trout always feed in the day and always hide at night. And now we find out this is what's really important, because now we get a completely different response. Besides getting far lower populations, the abundance actually went up with food up to a certain level and then started decreasing again. So why does activity selection appear to be the main thing that lets the population keep going up with food availability? And basically, it's a mechanism by which the fish can convert food to survival. So this graph shows the percent of adults that are feeding. The blue line is at night, and the red line is in day, as we turn up the food concentration. So as we make more and more food available, almost all the fish are feeding at night, and then it starts out at low food concentrations. Many of the fish are feeding during the day, but that drops almost to zero because they don't need to go out during the day. So they're feeding at night, which lets them avoid predation risks, so they don't get eaten as often. So the more of them survive and the population goes up. And then as the food gets really high, you can see that fewer of the fish are actually feeding each night. And so there's so much food that the fish don't even have to feed every day. They can go out for one night and maybe not have to feed at all for the next day. So that's another way that they can avoid predation and increase the population. So is this conceptual model of food limitation useful for conservation? Well, no, at least not in our individual-based model. Instead, what we've seen in lots and lots of analyses is that because of these trade-off behaviors, virtually any factor that affects the growth or the survival of the individuals is likely to have some effect on the population at any point. But the strength of those effects varies among factors. So, I mean, the importance of food definitely can be stronger when food is scarcer, but there's always some effect, and there's always some effect of predation risk, and some effect of metabolic rates, et cetera, like that. So this concept that either one thing or another limits the population, we just don't really see that in our individual-based model. So finally, why conservation biologists will someday rule theoretical ecology. And I'm saying that I choose to believe this, whether or not I really do. But I really think that ecologists realize that they have to address complexities such as behavior and their effect on ecology. And classical modeling approaches really are not really useful for this. But bottom-up models like individual-based models can be useful, but are they theoretical? And they kind of have a reputation as not being theoretical, as being kind of ad hoc and site-specific and not generally applicable. But we can develop general theory for individual-based models, and I mean reusable models that are based on basic concepts like trying to maximize your fitness that can explain population and community dynamics and complexities. And the way that we do that is by studying specific problems of real systems, like the examples I just showed. We want to test our models of behavior and show that they reproduce realistic behaviors. And to do that, you have to work in a real system where you have real observations. And that's exactly what we conservation biologists do. So I think there should be a more closer interaction between the two fields of theoretical ecology and conservation biology as we go down this route. So finally, I just want to let you know about some resources in case you're interested in this kind of stuff. All the papers that I mentioned and a lot of our work is described on our website at Humboldt State. Volker Grimm and I produced this monograph in 2005, and we realized that the monograph is not something that is easy to teach a course out of, so we produced a textbook which is now in press, and it should be out this October. It's designed to let students teach themselves how to get started with individual-based modeling using a very simple modeling platform called NetLogo. And also we hope that professors that want to teach a class in individual-based modeling can use this textbook even if they're not already experienced with this kind of modeling. All right.